Welcome back, everybody who has joined these webinars in the past and will continue to do them in the future. If this is your first time, thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And real quick, I'm Derek White, the Chief Operating Officer here at Beryllium in a Quick Track. So yes, these have been really informational webinars, and we've kind of done them in an order of topic because it flows together month to month. So this one's going to be a little bit more fun for me because I don't have to do hardly any of the talking. So that's awesome. But we have been featuring subject matter experts from different parts of the industry with different topics when it comes to both CMMC and what contractors that are looking to pursue and or achieve or figure out when it comes to their contracts and the requirements on the cybersecurity side. So today we've got Kate Sheets, Director of Contracts and Procurement at ATI, and Chris, you've introduced yourself. I'll let you guys talk about yourselves a little bit, but at the end, we'll come back for Q&A. So Chris, thank you for stepping on that a few times. Q&A all day long. We'll get to what we can at the end. And from here, I'll let you guys take it away.
Okay, thank you, Derek. I'll pass it over to Kate to introduce herself, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Sheets. I'm a Director of Contracts and Procurement here at ATI. And over the last 10 years, I've been mainly supporting DoD contracts. So grateful to be with you all today. I'll share, what I've seen over those 10 years as the department has increased security requirements and, what we're looking at in the future.
Okay, thanks, Kate. So as Derek mentioned, today's webinar will be a little bit different with ATI taking the lead on this. So we're talking about pursuing contracts that contain CUI. So we'll be going through a few items. So we'll be talking about CUI. We'll be talking about the contractual clauses that apply, that have always applied, and now that are new in this world of CMMC. We'll touch on CMMC, and then we'll talk about some other items as well that are related to dealing with CUI in DoD contracting. So without further ado, I'll get started. So the first question is, what is CUI? So up here, we've got the definition. We have the definition on the screen, but big picture, CUI is a government designation, controlled unclassified information. Keyword there is unclassified. So if you see that last sentence in the last clause in that definition, it's not classified. However, it does require additional safeguarding and dissemination controls due to the sensitivity of that information. It was established by Executive Order 13556 many years ago. You can see it on that screen. That executive order came out in 2010, and that directed the different departments and agencies to kind of establish their own CUI programs. Now focusing, and throughout this presentation, you'll see DoD and DOW both referenced, and it's mostly driven by whatever that source documentation or whatever website I pulled it from is calling the DoD as they're in that transition phase. So for this webinar, we're going to focus more specifically on CUI in the DOW DoD. The reason being, focused on a CMMC webinar, that is a DoD program. So now up here on the screen, I have the definition of CUI that the DoD DOW has provided. It's very similar to that definition provided in that executive order, with some slight changes, but big picture, nothing changed. It's unclassified information that's still sensitive and must be protected. So that one was established much later, DoD Instruction 5200.48. Prior to that instruction coming out, there were many different markings and different programs that existed throughout the DoD to govern that more sensitive information. So this brought it all under one roof. So that instruction is good to know. Additionally, the DoD has a website that's completely dedicated to the CUI program. So it's there on the screen, dodcui.mil, if you want to learn more. So now that we've talked about what CUI is, how do you identify that you're looking at CUI, or how do you mark documents so that other people can know that they're working with CUI? So there are more instructions. So how do you identify it? One, if you're the reader, you can look, is it marked CUI? So here's and then if you are dealing with CUI and you know you are, then you need to mark it appropriately. So here is a quick overview. I mean, we could talk about just marking CUI for this whole webinar or more, but we'll just hit the high points here. So at a minimum, if you're dealing with CUI needs to be in the banner and the footer of the document. So it needs to be at the top of the bottom. It has to state CUI so that the reader knows what they're dealing with. Portion markings may also be included to identify individual sections. So if you're using portion markings, each section, part, paragraph, however else it's broken up, needs to either have that U or CUI as applicable. If there's anything with CUI in it, that means if any of those portions are marked CUI, that means the top and bottom of that page need to be marked with CUI. And one of the advantages of that portion marking is it helps the reader know which portion is CUI and what portions are just publicly releasable. Excuse me. And then in addition to those markings on the top and bottom and portion markings, so the first page of the document or material that includes the CUI needs to have that designation indicator. So this is going to provide a more detailed information. So it's going to be talking about who it's controlled by, the individual POC, point of contact, what CUI category, which we'll get into a little bit on the next slide, and any specific distribution and dissemination controls, which again, we'll get to in a couple slides. So CUI categories. So here's that website again, that dodcui.mil. It has a web page in there that lists the different categories and their abbreviations. So if a certain category is applicable, they should show that. I'll go back to the previous slide in that block that says CUI category. And then each of these, as you can see on that screenshot from that website, it says click on an abbreviation, category name, or index group to go to that page. Each of these has its own page. Here I've highlighted CTI, the controlled technical information, because in our work, that's generally what we're dealing with. So that's a index group defense, meaning that that's who owns it. So it's the DoD. In most of the CUI that we deal with, because we're in that technical side of developing new technologies for the government and not on the operational side. So if we scroll down that list, there's a CUI offset category. Controlled technical information is mostly what's applicable here. So that's why I have that highlighted. And then next, what the next portion of that block is distribution dissemination controls. So here are some dissemination controls and distribution statements that are pretty standard in what we work with. So again, trying to focus this most on the DoD contracting and what we see with our experience. So this table comes from DoD instruction 5230.24. And you can get a much more detailed description if you go into that instruction, but here just highlighting the big points. From that table, highlighted the things that we see most frequently and what we see in our work. So starting at the top, distribution statement A, you're not going to see that with CUI because approved for public release, distribution is unlimited. By that very nature, it's not going to be CUI. We see distribution statement C, where distribution is authorized to U.S. government agencies and their contractors, and other requests for this document must be referred to whomever. And then distribution statements D is probably what we see the most with these distribution statements, where that distribution is limited to just the DoD and US DoD contractors only. The reason working with some government customers, so some people will mark things distribution statement C. I've been seeing that less and less as you do have government representatives saying that's all government agencies and their contractors. So why does, like, this is critical technical information. Why does it make sense for this to be distributable to like a contractor for the U.S. Department of Agriculture? It doesn't make any sense. So then you'll see some other distribution statements there where the distribution is only authorized within the government. By the nature of that, we don't see that very much unless we're specifically authorized that distribution. Also, please note, they all finish with other requests for this document must be referred to whatever that controlling DoD office. And going back to that block on the first page that you should see should have an individual point of contact named. So if you do think that you need to share this document beyond what these distribution and statement controls say that you can reach out to that point of contact and ask if you can and get an answer from them to get that authorization. Now, next, I'll work towards transitioning towards talking about some of those contractual requirements when you're working through with CUI. But first, I'll talk about that CMMC timeline as that plays in. So Kate will talk about those contractual clauses. So she'll start off with some that have been in there for a long time, and then she'll talk about some that have been implemented since the CMMC program started. So I'll have this little reminder here of where are we on that CMMC timeline. So phase 1, where it was first implemented, began November 10th, 2025. So we are there in that first step. It is important to note the self-assessment versus C3PAO. If you want to learn more about how to get to that point of being that level 2 certified, please view our other webinars that are on that same CMMC resources page that we have put in the chat. And highlighted in just obligatory note down at the bottom of that graphic, it says in some procurements, DoD may implement CMMC requirements in advance of the plan phase. So even though we're in phase 1 and level 2 self-assessment is spelled out, the government customer that's making a solicitation, they can require CMMC level 2 C3PAO if they would like. So now I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you, Chris. And before I dive into everything on the contractual side, we did get a couple questions. And I think to paraphrase, the questions all kind of center around, there's a lot of information in DoD contracting, and whether it's a part number or an inspection record or, an engineering sheet, how do we know just by looking at something whether or not it's CUI? In a nutshell. So I'll take the first stab at it, and then feel free to add on or correct me. But in general, to summarize, the government is responsible for marking their information as CUI using the banners and the footers and all the categories that Chris just took us through. So the government is responsible for marking those things as CUI, or including very prescriptive direction in your contract for when you create a specific piece of information or report, etc., how you should label it as CUI. Chris, anything to add on or correct on that before I dive into the contract stuff?
Yeah, and I think the only thing to add on is when in doubt, contact that point of contact listed or your contract officer representative, agreements officer representative as applicable for any guidance.
Yes, no, that's great. Thank you. And thanks for having me and letting me dive into the contractual side of all this. I want to get into the details, but I'll also be sharing some more history overall on these different clauses, hopefully to illustrate the fact that CMMC, it's been a long time coming and it is officially here. So as a contractor, if you haven't already decided what being CMMC ready looks like for your business, and if you aren't already where you want to be, you really do need to get there ASAP, because without that, in the meantime, you're almost doing yourself a disservice in your DoD business pursuits. So before we get to the star of the show, which of course is CMMC, I want to start with a different DFARS clause, DFARS 7012. So 7012 first came onto the scene in 2015, aimed at increasing cybersecurity of CUI throughout the defense industrial base. So having this clause added to a contract at the time triggered two really big things. First, this is when, as contractors, we became required to report any cyber incident that impacted the program or your networks to the DoD via the DIBnet portal. And the rapid part was it needed to be within 72 hours of discovery, and keyword discovery. Next, contractors then became required to implement or have a very detailed plan on how to implement the 110 cybersecurity controls that are found in NIST 800-171. So 7012, it is a mandatory flow down all the way through a contractor's supply chain when it's applicable. So if we have any subcontractors on the line, know that when you see 7012, you're signing up to these same things. And 7012, it really started the self-attestation era, and the clause is indeed still being used today. All that being said, the DoD didn't really stop there in 2015 and spent the next several years developing what we now know as the CMMC program. And that moves us away from self-attestation and into actual certification. So coincidentally, now we're talking about DFARS 7021. Same numbers, different order, different clause. 7021, that rolled out in late 2025 when the department published the final rule in the Federal Register, and it took effect that same year. And this is really what integrated the CMMC program into the DFARS and made DFARS 7021 broadly applicable to DoD contracts. So 7021 is what moves us out of self-attestation and into actual certification. The good news with that is 7021 really is just building upon what we've been working to under 7012. And what I mean by that, it's still the same 110 security requirements in NIST 800-171 that contractors have been working towards for over a decade. There are differences, of course, additions. Three big ones to touch on really quickly is first, this new 7021 CMMC clause. This requires contractors or subcontractors to have the right CMMC certification level in place, essentially before submitting a proposal, but definitely before actually getting awarded a contract. It will be a condition of contract award. Another thing that's different is it requires the contractor to actually have an active CMMC record in SPRS and to keep it updated annually with recertifying compliance. In addition, another big change is that it requires the contracting officer to provide constant updates to the contracting officer anytime their CMMC UID, which is a tracking number, tied to your CMMC certification. Anytime that changes or anytime you need to have additional UIDs start performing on your contract. So 7021 also is a mandatory flow down to your subs who are going to process, store, or transmit CUI or FCI. And it's the interesting thing about this clause is that it goes into a lot of detail about how or what the prime contractor is required to do to properly manage their subs and to properly ensure their subcontractors' compliance with the clause. And that really is different. You look at your average FAR or DFARS clause, and sure, it might use terms like, at all levels or include a flow down. But this one really does go above and beyond in being very prescriptive. So that's going to be, perhaps a little different for primes and subs in their relationships. So with all that being said, on the next slide, we're going to talk through, kind of the flow of how this all works behind the scenes with government contracting. But I do want to give a quick disclaimer that this is really new. It's really, it was only official as of the end of last year. So it's a change for your government contracting officers as well. The CMMC program comes with a whole list of procedures that the government contracting officers will also have to follow. Probably not their idea or definition of fun either. And even though, the steps that we're going to go through are very clear, they're not overly prescriptive. So usually what happens when clauses like this roll out is that government leadership or policy departments provide supplemental guidance to their contracting officers on what exactly they need to do. And to the best of my knowledge, that day-to-day prescriptive guidance hasn't come out yet, or at least not to all offices. So suffice to say, we'll walk through what we know today, but be prepared for things to change. So this, coupled with the fact that the CMMC program is intentionally a phased rollout, like Chris was just showing us on that timeline, and that there's some optionality for the government as well to implement things maybe faster than those phases prescribe. It all kind of accumulates in what could be some confusion areas. So in a couple slides, we'll go over those potential points of confusion as well. Okay, all that being said, we'll jump into kind of those blocks. Sorry, on the previous slide, we'll just start at the beginning. So what we do know today is that DFAR subpart 204.75 takes us through how it should work from a contractual standpoint. So at a very high level, of course, with any contract, the government needs arises. With CMMC, it's actually first up to the government requiring office or the customer to identify, one, if CMMC is going to be required, and then two, at what level. So with that, your government contracting officer can then release that RFP, and ideally will include DFAR's 7025, which is a notice of CMMC. That notice should let you, as a contractor, know what level of CMMC is anticipated. And it, excuse me, that's also what requires you, excuse me. There's just so much good stuff to talk about. That's also what requires you to, in your proposal, list out the CMMC UIDs that you'll be using. And even beyond that, it requires you to keep those UIDs updated after submission. So if you submit and then your UID changes, you have to go back to your contracting officer and give them that new UID number. Again, this is pretty different than most of the things that we're used to. And the next block, and this is more implied than explicitly stated, but it's essentially implied that when a prime contractor is preparing their proposal, they're not only identifying their own CMMC UIDs that will be used, but if they know they're going to use subs, they should probably be gathering the UIDs of that subcontractor as well. Maybe even asking that sub to provide proof, like a copy of their SPRS record. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. In the next block, the next thing that happens, the offeror is going to actually submit their proposal and identify those CMMC UIDs that they're using. And again, contractor has to keep the contracting officer up to date as new UIDs are generated. Then if we fast forward, when the contracting officer is getting ready to actually issue the award or the contract, the contracting officer has to go into SPRS personally and verify that all those UIDs that were provided are still current and are still at the correct level. So when the contracting officer then issues the contract, it's probably going to include both 7012 and 7021. And signing up to that is what then contractually requires you to not only maintain that specific CMMC level, but to do those annual attestations, to keep the government contracting officer informed anytime you get a new CMMC UID, and to ensure your subcontractors' compliance in those very specific ways. Honestly, it's a lot of the same things that you're having to do as the prime. Your subcontractor, you'll have to ensure that your subcontractors do as well. So much so in the next block that before you even put a subcontractor on contract, you have to check and make sure that their record is up to date and at the right level. And then lastly, throughout execution, you're ensuring your own compliance, you're ensuring your subs compliance, so on and so forth throughout the supply chain. And then the contracting officer, their job's not done either. Anytime they need to extend your period of performance, or if they want to exercise an option with you, they even have to go back in to SPRS and recheck the CMMC UIDs at that point. So obviously it's important to keep them updated. One, because you're contractually required to, but also you don't want to take your contracting officer by surprise, right? If they go into SPRS, rerun the UIDs, and then find out some are no longer valid, why don't we have a new one? A lot of confusion could come up there. So this was an overview of what it looks like for a new award. And though it's not anticipated to be common practice, it is within the realm of possibilities that the government could add CMMC to pre-existing contracts. And you might especially see that, again, if extending or exercising an option. Okay, so all that being said, we can go to the next slide. For subcontractors specifically. So as a subcontractor, hopefully, having that framework and seeing what the government and the primes are going through is helpful, but there are a few extra things for you to be aware of as well. So first, CMMC applicability and the various levels, they're very much going to be on a subcontract by subcontract basis. And yet, if you're not expecting to handle CUI on that given subcontract, you may still have CMMC flowed down to you, but it should really only be at level 1, because at that point, it's only for FCI. So it's not the full-blown that would be required for for CUI level 2 or above. And different primes will undoubtedly manage things differently. But ideally, primes soon, when they send you a request for a proposal, will be able to identify whether or not CUI will be involved, and if CMMC applies, and if so, what level would be required. Unfortunately, if they get surprised by the government with a last-minute change, a last-minute addition of, oh, CMMC will apply, unfortunately, they probably will have to surprise you as well. Which is why, we kind of said at the top of all this that it's so important to be ready now, before pursuing this type of work. That being said, just a couple other things. It is also very likely that the prime contractor will come to you asking for you to share a copy of your SPRS record with them, with visibility of not only those CMMC UID numbers, but the associated dates, probably multiple times in the pre-award process and then throughout execution. In fact, if you ever have trouble falling asleep at night, you can read the final rule in the Federal Register and see that during the public Q&A portion, the government responded several times to industry that even though the government was going to be requiring industry to verify all these things of their subcontractors, that no, indeed, industry is not being given access to those records in SPRS. Instead, the government shares in their written Q&A that the government is very much counting on industry to voluntarily share those records with each other for that verification piece. And then lastly on the slide, when it comes to the actual subcontract clause, the prime is probably going to ask you to report your changes directly to them rather than reporting that directly to the government contracting officer. So again, while it's not anticipated to be common practice, you could see this potentially show up in a current subcontract that you have if the government determines that CMMC is now applicable, especially again at the time of extension or exercising an option. So that was a lot of information, but just to wrap up, to highlight and clarify a few different potential points of confusion, just in hopes that maybe it saves your teams some time or some energy. First, know that DFARS 7021 is not going to replace 7012. You should anticipate continuing or seeing both of them in contracts moving forward. And whether you're a prime or a sub, if you aren't actually going to process, store, or transmit CUI under the contract or the subcontract, it's possible that you might still see the CMMC clause, but if you do, seemingly it should really only be at level 1. And that would be, again, for FCI purposes only. If you saw it at level 2 or above, that's definitely a reason for pause and to figure out what's going on. Next, I think we all know it wouldn't be government contracting without lots of acronyms. So, we've been using the acronym CMMC UID several times in this presentation, which is what connects directly to one specific CMMC certification. Again, that's the number that's generated in SPRS for you. Unfortunately, UID sounds a lot like UEI, which is already used in government tracking or government contracting. You're familiar with that if you've already gone into SAM and registered, your business unit just to even do business with the federal government. So that's a point of confusion. And further, UID also sounds very familiar to IUID, which is a different tracking number that's used. And this is tied to, physical items for tracking purposes under a totally different DFARS clause. So unfortunately, these are acronyms that your teams could get confused with each other. So it's a good thing to keep an ear out for. And then all that being said, UIDs, they're more fragile than most government assigned ID numbers. And what I mean by that is a UID is going to get generated each time you go into SPRS to update a new CMMC certification. So if you add a network, remove a network, it's possible that you would get a new UID. No matter what, when you get a CMMC certification, it's only going to be good for a certain number of years. And when it reaches that end of life and you have to get a new certification, you will definitely get a new UID. And like we said earlier, you are required to keep your government contracting officer up to date anytime that you do get new UIDs. So whether you are a prime or a sub and you're having to do that reporting, it will probably benefit you to, when you report the new UID, explain if this is a UID that maybe is replacing a previous UID and why, or clarify if it's like, hey, we've got a new business unit coming online to support this effort, and here is their UID. That's something that hopefully will save some confusion between you and your government contracting officer, or between you and your prime contractor. So with that, Chris, I can pause to answer any questions if you've seen any come in, or if not, hand it back over to you to take us through a potentially confusing topic of how to properly share CUI.
Okay, thanks, Kate. A lot of the questions it seems like you've already answered, so we'll go ahead and move on.
Awesome.
So one of the big questions, how to share CUI properly. So number one step, so when you're actually working with a CUI, you need, no matter whether or not CMMC applies, you need to ensure the recipient meets all the requirements identified in the distribution and dissemination controls and the applicable instructions. If CMMC is included in the contract or agreement, then the recipient must also have the appropriate CMMC status. Uh, Related to a question that I saw in the Q&A as well, when sending CUI, you need to send via properly encrypted means in accordance with NIST 800-171. There was a question in the Q&A asking about the sending internally. So you'll have to rely on your internal IT policies and security policies on that. I know here at ATI, all of our internal emails are behind our secure network. Therefore, I can send CUI via email to Kate Sheets within ATI because it's all behind that encrypted network. But if your network is set up differently, you may have to do something else. So I'll just rely on your internal policies that have been established. Then I saw another question that this will hopefully help to answer. Someone asked about the tie between the DD Form 2345 and CUI and CMMC. So this is kind of the introduction to that, and we'll get into it a little bit more as the slides go on. But DD Form 2345, according to DoD Instruction 5230.24, is required for distribution C and D information. So there it is. It says export control technical information marked with distribution statement C or D will not be distributed outside the U.S. government or to U.S. government contractors without first verifying that they have a DD 2345. So if you have worked with ATI in the past, as many of you have, are members of our consortium, this is why we do require you to have a DD Form 2345 prior to joining most, if not all, of our DoD tied consortia, because we do post that distribution statement C and D information on our members only websites. So in order for you to get access to those, we need you to have that 2345. In order for you to get full use out of your membership, you need to have access to our websites. So what is the purpose of that 2345? So the title of it, Military Critical Technical Data Agreement. So that certification is required per a DoD directive if you need to handle access unclassified export control technical information for the following purposes. That pretty much covers anything. So solicitations, conference meeting attendance, RFPs, research and development projects involving export controlled information. All of those things apply to your memberships in our consortia. The last thing, to participate in a directly arranged visit, that one's not as applicable, but everything else is applicable. But because we do host those meetings at that CUI level, which is why we ask for those security forms before you attend our meetings. So now most of you have DD2 through 45s because most of you are our members. But if you're looking to renew it, or if you are not our member and are looking how to obtain that 2345. So this is all managed by the DLA's Joint Certification Program Office. If you just type into Google DLA JCP, it'll take you to this website. I want to highlight some things in this process of how to obtain a 2345. There are some prerequisites that are shown in that shot on the left. So your company must be registered and physically located in the US or Canada. Must have an active SAM registration and cage code. And the big thing, one of the big things, complete a cybersecurity assessment, NIST 800-171, and upload the results to the SPRS system. So that sounds awfully similar to what we've been talking about earlier with the tie-in to CMMC. That same requirement, NIST 800-171. Currently, for the 2345, you only require this self-assessment. It does not require that CMMC level 2 status. And then you follow the rules for protecting sensitive information, and then you can request access and complete your application. And if you have any questions or if you get lost along the way or need any advice as you're applying to a consortium, or if you're already a member of a consortium, please reach out to that consortium team, and they'd be happy to either help you or point you in the right direction. So now CMMC and the DD Form 2345. So I touched on that a little bit. So if you go to that JCP website, up at the top, they will have this bright yellow banner talking about CMMC. And they'll say also see CMMC for a JCP section below. So this is what it says. I highlighted the most critical part. So it highlights that November 10th, 2028 date, where if you're seeking a new or renewed JCP certification, you must have CMMC level 2 certification from a C3PAO. So on that when we enter that phase 4 of full implementation, that's when you'll need that CMMC level 2 C3PAO in order to get a new or renew your current 2, 3, 4, 5. Now CMMC and CUI. So if CMMC is included in your contract agreement, you must verify the CMMC status for your subcontractors and partners prior to sharing CUI with them on their systems. So this is why ATI has been sending out surveys to our consortium members to determine what your CMMC status is, because as this CMMC requirements get implemented into each of our OTAs, we will have to implement these controls. Kate mentioned earlier, only the government has access to SPRS to verify CMMC status. So in order for us to verify your CMMC status, for us to be able to openly share CUI with you, once it's implemented on that particular program, you need to provide us with the export from SPRS, including some key information. So that UID that Kate talked about, the CMMC status. So for example, that level 2 self, the cage codes covered by the assessment scope, and the assessment affirmation expiration dates. So to answer that cage codes covered by the assessment scope, I did see a question in the Q&A asking about, hey, if we have 5 cage codes or 5 locations within my organization, are we all covered under one UID? Maybe. So if that's how you scope your assessment, and you're all on the same network, and that's how you scope your assessment, and that's how your C3PO assesses it, then yeah, those 5 cage codes may be under one UID. You may have a different setup that makes more sense for them to be broken out into 5 different ones or split into 2. But yeah, you may run into a situation where you have 5 on the same. I think from some of our member companies, some of those larger companies, we have seen some with more than 10 cage codes on a single UID. Now I want to highlight some resources available to you. So if you want to learn more about CUI, you can always reach out to us. So that's that bottom line there. But if you want to learn more about CUI, I'll highlight that website again, dodcui.mil. If you want to learn more about CMMC, again, you can always reach out to us. But the DoD CIO website about CMMC has all the resources there. They keep that up to date. For 2345, the best resource is that JCP website that I highlighted earlier. And then we also have our own CMMC resources webpage, and that has recordings of the previous webinars. It has links to key sites, and it will have the recording and the presentation from this webinar available here in the coming days. And then lastly, I said it earlier, but if you're a member of a consortium, and you're confused or you have questions, don't hesitate to contact your consortium team. You can reach out to our program management office at pmoffice@ati.org, or you can reach out to cmmc.info@ati.org. Any of those 3 or all of the above, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction. So that's all for my part of the presentation. On this last slide, we do have our CMMC info email address up here, and then we also have the info@berylliuminfosec.com if you have some CMMC specific questions.
Awesome. Do we want to open up for some live questions? Chris and Kate, I know there's a lot to go through, and you guys kind of highlighted some of these, but
Yeah.
we have some time left over.
Okay, so I do see one that I'll turn over to Kate. So there's a question: CMMC can become a requirement on existing contracts via mod, like exercising option year. So can you talk about how it can be exercised via mod, Kate?
Sure, absolutely. So again, it boils down to the ultimate government customer or requiring office determining that CMMC is applicable to the contract, right? So even though CMMC is written to be focused on new contracts moving forward, it's not impossible for the determination to be made that an existing contract, needs to be protected in accordance with CMC. So I'll do a throwback to the part where I said a lot of government offices are still working on their internal guidance for exactly how these things will work or what it'll look like or the processes to be followed. So take this with a bit of salt, but the big things that would have to happen is one, you as the contractor would have to be informed that this change has happened. You would likely be asked for your CMMC UIDs because that are being used on that specific contract. And that's because the contracting officer is going to have to go into SBRS and make sure that you're at the right level for, for the requirement, level 1, level 2 self, etc. And then they would issue you what should be a bilateral mod for you to review that would have not only the period of performance extension or the option exercise, but also adding in that DFARS 7021 clause. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, they didn't do anybody any favors by taking DFAR 7021 as the confusing number of 7012 that's there. But yeah, I'll chime in here quick too, because I know there's a lot of questions that were really good questions. I think you guys hit on this a little bit too. Use the emails and the contact info. Talk to Chris and Kate and their team on some of those specific ones that are huge. Those are really good questions in this Q&A, but some of them are a little more specific, and some of them are kind of unfortunately, it's not anybody on this webinar's answer to make, but we can direct you into the right spots to go find, as you guys heard at the end there. But also some of it depends, which is a tough thing, as Kate's highlighting, is it should be clear in some cases, and sometimes it's just not. However, this was intended to be rolled out as a phased-in approach. So there are some things that can be very confusing on what to do first, but your scope is everything. If you go back to the first link that we shared at the beginning of this presentation, there are multiple webinars from the past. If you haven't seen those, kind of start from the beginning, work them into your schedule, but there are highlights of scope and CUI versus FCI, some of the stuff that we're talking about today. This is a little bit of a dangerous topic to just kind of throw into the wild, but it does matter. Authorize. What do I do if someone needs to do something with CMMC level 2, but they're not authorized or certified? That becomes a question that the organization has to answer, but you have to kind of understand that impact to your scope and your contract, your deliverables, terms and conditions, etc. It's something that we've been dealing with for 8 years on our side, actually 10 years for a lot of us here. ATI is doing this every single day. If you want to participate, you want to grow the business and be awarded these contracts, the CMMC details do matter, and we don't want people making wrong decisions that they don't, that they just didn't know about, and then that impact comes later. So I just wanted to highlight that because you guys did a great job of laying that out, but those details are very, very important to understand on the organizational level.
Okay, and now we'll just hit up a few more questions before we wrap this up. There were a series of questions at the beginning asking about very specific things as to whether things are considered CUI. So there's part number, inspection records, or process sheets. So that comes back to that question that Derek mentioned. Or the answer that Derek mentioned. That's the hardest answer to give. Of it depends. So that if you do have questions about whether or not something is CUI that's related to a project that you're executing, there should be dissemination controls that from that source CUI document that you have that have a point of contact. You should have a AOR or core assigned to that project, reach out to those individuals for those specific questions. We can't give a blanket answer of is a part number from a CUI document considered CUI, because there are too many situations where that could be different. I saw another question in here of, will a member company be kicked out if they're not able to renew the DD2345 due to any delays with C3PAO assessments? No. So we don't, across all of our consortia, we don't kick out members because they don't have a 2345. So that 2345 is an entry requirement. Sometimes those expire. There's a delay in renewing them. We don't kick anybody out for that. We just have to remove access to our secure websites. And then talking about C3PAO assessment, so tying to CMMC. So CMMC status is not a requirement for membership across any of our consortia, and you do not have to have a CMMC status to get a 2345. That's supposed to change in November 2028. But as of right now, there's no need for that.
Hey, Chris, I see another good question, but I need your help in making sure that the words that I use to answer it come out the right way. So there's a question about, can you have a subcontractor on a program that is not CMMC level 2 if you make sure that they never receive anything that is marked CUI? You know, if they're never processing, storing, or transmitting. So I would say that is a possibility. If you need to subcontract to someone and they can do the entire scope that you need them to do without ever receiving CUI information, then yes, that is a very real possibility. And you would not have to flow down that level 2 requirement to them. Any corrections for me, Chris, on that?
No, that's
Okay.
true.
Hopefully that helps.
The only thing I would add there, and that was a great answer, is being able to articulate that in your documentation on how that working engagement is going, will pretty much put a pin in that conversation when it comes to an assessment for you, whether you have to transfer that flow down per your contract requirements. So very important to have that.
And Derek, we do have one question that I'd like to pass over to you. So there's a question: if you have a consultant that is not CMMC level 2, can you give them a laptop to use that is managed by the prime? Can you talk about that and maybe some other options that may be available as well?
Yeah, I don't want to make too many assumptions on
Yeah.
this because the word consultant's a little vague. So but I think understanding that question. So there definitely is a difference between working within someone else's infrastructure and equipment, whether it's directly with the government or a prime or a customer of yours or someone working with you. The answer is still the same as what we've been talking about, is if they are not authorized to process and store CUI or have access to a system or service that does also process, store, or transmit CUI, then they are not allowed to access any of that. If the question is more, can the contractor support work as a non-full-time employee under the scope that you're working within say your CUI program and your CMMC level 2 boundary, if they are using equipment that is they are an authorized user, but they are in someone else's environment, and they have in this case a device that is a CUI asset, or is using some sort of a virtual desktop infrastructure, which is something like what we do at QuickTrack, the answer is yes, that can be done, but they are in your scope of your CUI that have to be authorized. They cannot be in something as somebody who's not authorized to be CUI. But whether they're full-time or contract, there are ways to do that for sure. And I'll leave it at that, because that onion we don't want to peel every layer off of in this call with 5 minutes left.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. And I think there are some more questions out there. We'll be able to export those and get the rest of the Q&A out to you all. Again, the recording of this presentation and the presentation materials will be posted on our CMMC resources page in the coming days. And thank you to Derek for helping us out here. Kate, thank you for your contributions, and to everyone who joined, thank you for your time to join and hear what we have to say.